In this first chapter, we will cover the Notch user interface and how to use the software. I'll teach you how to navigate the 3D viewport, how to use the node graph, including changing the node properties, as well as the basis of timeline animation. After this chapter, you'll be ready to start using the tool. Hello and welcome to Notch Essential Course. In this chapter, we will talk about UI. Notch consists of 7 main UI panels. Right in front of us here, we see 5 of them. Here in the top left corner, we see resources, where all our external files are handled. Next to it, we have properties. Properties correspond with specific settings that we would set in one or the other node in the system. And here we have a viewport. So in the viewport, we build our designs. Actually, to see the viewport better, let's turn on the grid. So I'm going to press Alt-G. A little bit lower here in the right corner, we have node list. And as you see, we have quite a few nodes to choose from. All of them are color-coded, and color coding corresponds with specific systems that these nodes work with. For instance, these are all deformers. And here we have a vast list of post effects. Right next to it, we have a node graph. This is exactly where we build all our designs using the very nodes that we have in the node list. We already have one node available for us in our node graph, and that's the root node. Root node holds the main rendering properties in Notch. So anything from deferred rendering to anti-aliasing to composite blend modes and alpha channels. Right here on the left-hand side, we have several tabs, and these tabs hold timeline, where we can see Notch nodes arranged as layers, and curve editor, where we can refine and precise our keyframed animations. We will come back to the curve editor and the timeline as we progress. So how do you navigate node graph? Navigation is done with 2 buttons. So it's Control for zoom and Alt for pan. You can use middle mouse key for that as well. Let's come back to the node list and let's add a node to the scene. I'm typing shape 3D and I'm going to pull that from the list. Shape 3D is our proprietary 3D object. It contains quite a few shapes inside of it, so anything from sphere to a box to capsule, so on and so forth. As you see, node came in hashed out gray. That indicates that it's not connected or not rendering just yet. For us to render this node in a viewport, we have to connect it to the root node. And that is true to the majority of nodes in the system. Majority of them will have to be connected to the scene root or appropriate root for a specific system that the node corresponds to. We can delink the node from the root by pressing Ctrl-Shift and hovering over the line. As soon as it becomes red, we can click on it and it will delete the link. We have a shortcut for connecting nodes to the root. That would be Ctrl-R, R for the root. Now, as you see, this node came with 3 points of interest. On the top here, we have parenting that we just used. We have an output and we have input. Input is a variable, so there could be quite a few of them available for us from the get-go. In this case, there's only one, material. We have quite a few things visible for us from the get-go. The grid, the range indicators, bounding boxes, and handles. Be aware that you can turn them on and off in this mid panel. Every single node in Notch has a properties panel. Properties panel corresponds with different attributes and different settings that you can change in a node. In this case, we have a 3D object, we can move it in a 3D space, we can alter its appearance, and we can make changes to its rendering properties. There's quite a few more settings that we're going to cover as we progress through the course. Let's talk a little bit about the panels in general. As you see, there is a range that is set by default, so it's from -10 to 10. We're not bound by this range. We can exceed it by either manually typing in the numeric value that we want, or by holding Alt and dragging a little bit further outside of the given -10 to 10 value. If you want to change the value in a smaller increment, hold Ctrl and drag. We can reset the whole node to its default state by hitting the top rewind button, and we can reset a specific parameter by hitting the bottom one. I think I'm going to set this shape 3D to a box, and I'm going to make some rotation and positional alterations. You can build presets for every single node in Notch. All you have to do is press this plus key, give it a name, and it will be available for you here in this dropdown. I'm going to reset the node, and I'm going to apply the preset I just built. Now let's move on to the viewport, and let's talk about navigation in the viewport. We have 4 ways that we can manipulate this model. So it's positions, rotations, scale, and unified scale. We can access all 4 of these properties with shortcut E, R, T, Y. Navigation in viewport is done with a combination of 3 buttons: Control, Shift, and Alt. Alt would pan, Control Alt would zoom in, Shift Alt pans on the X, and Shift Alt with the right key pans on the Y axis. Just a quick reminder, you have a PDF file with shortcuts available for you in a asset folder. Let's rename this shape 3D. I'm going to right click on a node and I'm going to go for node settings. I'm going to call this a sphere. I'm going to bring it a little bit upwards. I'm going to grab a new shape 3D and connect it to the root. We have 2 shape 3Ds in the scene, but we only see one. The reason why we see only one is because both of these shapes are set to the same type, sphere, and they're positioned in the very same location. I'm going to offset the sphere a little bit further to the side. Now I'm going to come back to the shape 3D and I'm going to change this shape type to a box. Let's rename this node to a box. I can either right click and go for node settings, or I can hit F5. You probably already noticed that there's 3 icons next to majority of settings in Notch. First icon corresponds with opening a parameter for a media server use. We will cover that a little bit later in the course. Second one corresponds with keyframing, and the third one is locking the parameter so it wouldn't be alterable. Let's keyframe some properties, but before we keyframe anything, let's talk about timeline. If you want to run timeline in Notch, please press space. As soon as you start playhead in Notch, you will notice that there's a little change in the viewport. We don't see our handles anymore, and that's intentional. At some point, when you build a very big and complex design, it is very handy to clear your viewport from all the handles, all the bounding boxes while in play mode. If you go on to view panel, you have 2 options: show bounding boxes for all nodes, or show bounding boxes and range indicators while playing. I usually go for show bounding boxes and range indicators while playing. Right, let's bring back our time marker to the 0 position. We can do that by hitting home. Or if you are using laptop, arrow key back and FN button. So FN, arrow key back. You can do the very same operation here in Notch UI. Just use this icon right here, jump to start. I'm in the starting position, and I think I'm going to grab my sphere, and I'm going to animate its position X property. So I'm going to set a first initial keyframe on the 0 position. As you see, it came in marked up green. I will move time cursor to a 5-second mark, and I'm going to offset this value a little bit further, maybe to something like 4. If I reset to playhead now and start my animation, I see that this sphere is moving from its initial state to a 5-second mark to value of 4. Everything that is between the keyframes is marked up orange. You can actually jump between keyframes by holding Ctrl and arrow keys. I'm going to move the cursor a little bit further and I'm going to add another value. But this time, instead of dragging cursor marker, I will just type in desired time here straight away on the time indicator. You may have noticed that I'm not adding keyframes, but Notch is keyframing the value for me automatically. That is because we have auto key enabled. If you choose to have it disabled, all you have to do is click it off. I prefer to have it on. Let's start the playhead again. Okay, I think I'm going to animate the box now. I think I want to alter the rotation heading and let's say position Z value. So I'm going to set the initial keyframes. And I'm going to move to the 5-second mark. There we go. I mentioned that we can jump in between keyframes, but we cannot see our keyframes right here. This is good time to switch to timeline view. We've checked it out very briefly in the beginning of the chapter. In the timeline view, I see all my keyframes that I laid out. I can alter their timings if I want to. I can mark them up and delete them by simply pressing delete key. If I want to get rid all of the keyframes of a specific node, all I have to do is hold Shift and hover over the keyframe icon here in the Properties panel. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to bring the keyframes back. I can press Ctrl Alt to narrow the view or to expand the view. Easy way of changing timeline and node graph views would be F1 and F2. Notice that Notch focuses on a selected node. If you press F1 and if you press F2 twice, it actually brings you to the layer view with a specific chosen node highlighted. Let's get back to the keyframes. If we want to refine our animations, we can press on the third panel here, Curve Editor. Here we can pick and choose a specific keyframe that we want, and we can change its interpolation. We can change keyframe values straight from this view, and we can even change its timing by holding Alt. If you want to expand or shorten your timeline, right-click on a layer name and go for Layer Settings. Here you have an option to rename the layer and change its timing. Notice my layer became longer by 15 seconds, but the nodes inside of it stayed as long as they were before. If I want nodes to expand to a length of the actual layer, I would come back to the layer, right-click on it, and I would go for Scale Children to Parent Length option. We're not bound to just one layer in the Notch file. We could have quite a few of them here. By default, Notch is reading every single layer as a separate effect. And that is for the benefit of media servers, as they interpret Notch files exactly like that. If you want to treat Notch as more linear editing software, where you have multiple layers and you fade from one layer to another, you would have to go to Project, Settings, and tick off option stating layers as separate effects. All of a sudden we can populate this timeline view with a range of layers, and they can fade and cut just like any other video editing software would. I'm going to make a new layer. So for me to see both layers at the same time, I'm going to untick the S key. Now both layers are rendering at the same time. The bottom layer is taking the priority, and that's exactly why we don't see anything that's going on in the bottom one. So on the top layer, I can add Shape 3D. Perhaps I will color it so we see better what is on layer 1 and what's on layer 2. As mentioned in the beginning, on the root node we can change composite blend mode. So instead of solid, I'm going to choose blend with alpha channel. All of a sudden, we see both of the layers at the same time. I'm going to switch back to the default arrangement where every layer is treated as a separate effect. I can switch between layers now by pressing on the S key. Let's come back to the node graph and let's talk a little bit about cameras. Numeric values from 1 to 4 corresponds with standard 3D views. So left, top, right, bottom. 5 is the orb view. This is exactly where we were working so far. Let's add a custom camera to the scene. I'm going to type in camera to the node list, and I'm going to pull it from the list. I'm going to connect it to the root, Just like these 3D nodes, camera came to the very center of the graph. So I'm going to make sure to pull it a little bit back so the camera sees both of the shapes in its viewport. Now if I hit 0, I will see exactly what this camera sees. So 5 is the orb view, 0 is the active rendering camera. I'm going to restart the playhead. I'm pressing 5 now, and I'm going to change the camera's location. If you find yourself working on a scene and you navigate to a position in an orbit view, which you actually really enjoy, and you want to bring your camera there, right-click on the camera and choose Camera Options Set to Current View. All of a sudden, your camera will jump exactly where you had your orbit view. And if I hit 0 now, I'm looking through that camera in that specific location. As you see, we have quite a few stats here in the bottom. One of the first ones available is frame rate counter. In this case, we have very little going on in the scene, so the frame rate counter is quite high. It's 999 frames. Following frame rate counter, we have GPU and CPU counters. Let me draw your attention to the viewport and project pixel space. So our project is set to 1920 by 1080, but our viewport is quite higher. Notch dynamically adapts to available viewport space. You can lock your resolution to a specific chosen numeric value. Project, settings, rendering. That's exactly where you would do that. So the default state is a resize window overrides set size, but if you want to lock it to 1920 and 1080 or 3840 by 2160, just choose the second option, scale filter output to window. All of a sudden, viewport and project is locked to the same value. You can lock the project's frame rate too. You can do that via P icon. All of a sudden we are running 25 FPS in 4K. I think now we are quite familiar with properties, viewport, node list, and a node graph. The only thing we haven't been using much is resources. We will come back to this panel more as we will progress through the chapters. As a quick note, resources works as a drag and drop system. You get a list of brought in items and basic technical data. You can build folders in a resource panel. I briefly mentioned that you can build presets for the nodes. Well, you can actually build presets out of the groups of nodes too. So if I mark up both of these nodes and press Ctrl G, I'm sending both of these nodes now to a group. If I right click on a group, I can send it to bin. We can call out our bins from the View tab. As you see, there's already quite a few available for your use made by Notch team. This is the very one I just built. I can either connect this bin as a group, or I can ungroup it and connect the nodes one by one. Ungrouping is done by pressing Ctrl-Shift-G. I'm going to bring back the group. I usually connect it as a group and then I take out the grouping. That retains the links. The bins and presets that you've built you can always find in your documents. Notch folder, Notch presets, Notch bins. You can change your default location of bins, so File, Preferences, allows you to relocate it to a specific place where you feel it's more comfortable for you to use. If you are using a cloud service for your team, you can always put it on Dropbox or Google Drive or any other service that you're using. That will grant easier access to the bins for your team. Now, mind you, if you added new bins to the new location, your team would have to restart Notch for those bins to kick in and appear in the bin list. Now, since we opened the Preference panel, let's talk a little bit about several options here. You can set a creator's name. Your name or your company's name will follow your created file under the root node. You can set a specific increment of autosave. You can change the location of cache. And you can set a default parameter for screenshots and default location for screenshots. And if you have several GPUs installed in your machine, you can designate which GPU Notch should use. So as mentioned, creator's name comes under the root node. Anybody who opens the Notch file, makes alterations and saves it, will be listed in this creators tab. I briefly mentioned screenshots. So if you hit F8, you're taking a screenshot. And if you come back to your Windows file structure, Documents, Notch screenshots, that's exactly where you can find your screenshots. Okay, I think now we are ready to move on to workshops. So see you in chapter 2, video compositing and post effects.